2019, another two motors come onto the market for spec racing, which is basically 1/10 touring car 2S using blinky. These are also available in mod windings, but I'm going to particularly look at these, see how they perform in spec racing, especially the 17.5 turn and the 13.5 turn variations. These are sort of evolved motors of ones that exist already. This is the Surpass, and it's now the V5R. Previously it's been the V4, V4S, which were red, and this is now black. And the Fantom Icon, which has come around pretty quickly, because there was a Fantom Icon which was a red one which wasn't out too long ago, and now we've got the Fantom Icon Torque. Going to have a look at them, the full construction, and measure the performance and compare them to the previous ones and others that are class leading. For instance, there's the red Surpass V4. I don't have the Fantom, the red one here, but others that have been particularly good and come out recently is the upgraded Hobby Wing, which is the G3R, and this RevTech X Factor, which has been doing particularly well, came out very well in my tests. So it'll be interesting to see how they perform against those. There are a lot of other motors coming out as well, but I'm just going to look at these two in particular. And I've got all the specifications from previous motors, 13.5, 17.5, and I'm going to fill in the graph. I'll show the conclusions later. I won't bore you with all the tests I do using the various meters and things I've got. Other people do the tests in other ways, but I can, by comparing them, test them exactly the same way. At least we can compare. But I'll take them apart as well and look at the construction and measure the rotor strength, etc. One thing we can look at is what they're claiming for these motors. Now, on the Surpass, they don't tend to put out press releases, so you have to rely on what's written on the back. This is the red one where they talked about, well, it's a very strange font, but they just, in fact I can't even read it, this font's so strange. They've improved the font here, white on black now. They talk of the new and unique Stator design of the V5R, optimized to provide strong torque and high RPM, updating the cover and installing the vacancy avoidance space, which is very strange language. I think they just, I don't know what they mean by that. New Stator coating for better heat dissipation. Well, it is black, got like a black finish on it. Prevents surface corrosion. Yeah, we've seen the normal Stators are like silver and they're made, and they can go rusty. I've seen quite a few rusty motors, even new ones. Accurately mounted sensors. Well, they never get it right. They're all over the place. If you're lucky, get a really good one. CNC machined. Yeah, high purity copper windings. Yeah, dual port sensor. Well, it does have dual port sensor. A lot of them don't. It makes it very useful for installing all sorts of cars, from touring cars, pan cars and buggies, where you can't sometimes get the sensor lead in the right position. On the motor it says ultra low resistance. We'll look at that later. Comes in the plastic box, which is nice and solid, which is good. Now the Fantom Icon Torque. Now there's some information on the side, but I've made a copy of it, what they're talking about here. And the previous Fantom Icon Pro Spec motor, there was a lot of talk about the tuning pins, patent pending tuning pins, and they've been on tuning pins. They go on about it a lot. The tuning pins seem to have disappeared. There's no mention of them at all on this new torque motor. So let's see what they are talking about. All new torque edition, ultimate raw power, torque RPM efficiency. Again patented design, Stator. Maximum torque producing the most insane RPM ever seen before. Well, they talked about insane RPM before, as did SMC and some others. That's correct. Well, they another first. And unique design. We've totally eliminated the need for stator screws. Well, a lot of people, including the X Factor, have done this now by putting the screws around the back to hold the end bell on. Surpass don't do that. They've still got an aluminium screw, which is obviously non-magnetic, holding the case together. But a lot of others now, including the X Factor, as I said, and have gone to a screw on the back of three, one way or another, just to hold it on, and there's no long screws passing through. Up your game and see for yourself why the all-new Icon Torque Edition truly is a game changer. Whether you race on road, off-road one, I think they said that before on here about game changer. Up your game and see for yourself why the all-new Icon truly is a game changer. It's exactly the same wording. So it's another game changer. Let's see what else they say. High strength, heat resistant, sensor board, improved accuracy, maximum allowed copper wire, one piece can. Well, it is one piece now. This one, the joins, still got a back on that one. Premium grade steel. Well, a number of manufacturers talk about that. Chime in, usual stuff. So that's what they're claiming. Just point out that there are lots of claims made by other people. The X Factor, revolutionary timing ring, ultra low resistance, etc., etc., no fade. The SMC that had come out, well, I'm not sure if that's still around now. The Lowrider was an interesting motor, very lightweight. Every motor has one very tight tolerance, where they all are. And the G3R, the hobby wing, they had lots of very specific, well, I did another video about this, about literally percentage, 13.3%, 6.5, 8.6, all these things, very, they were saying it was improved. But it's very lightweight motor. It still needs a stronger rotor in my opinion, but it depends what their market is they're aiming at. Let's have a look at the Fantom. If you look at these side by side, even the cutouts, foam cutouts are very similar. You'd think they're made by the same company. Anyway, one thing I noticed, that they're both black, these motors, by the way. This is a very matte black, and this is slightly shinier. And you can see here that this has got a black coating on the stator laminations, and this one hasn't. So you've still got the steel colour. Side by side, you can see that the tags pretty much identical, including the riveting on the back and the way they've been cut out. One thing I did notice is that the shaft protrusion on the Fantom is slightly longer than on the Surpass, which was nice and short with the flat all the way down to the face. This flat goes all the way down as well, but it is 1.5 millimeters, possibly longer. Anyway, continuing looking at this one, it's got a tiny little bit of engraving on the end of the shaft. FAM 19585. Shimming, very nice, tiny bit of movement only. Cutouts, large cutouts for air to flow onto the windings, not on the stator, which some have concentrated on the stator. So you want to get air inside. Those are the 3 screws that hold the end on to the can, so there's no screw going all the way through anymore, even though the front isn't particularly cut away like on the X Factor. The front's cut away drastically. Just a single port on this one enables the back to be opened here, compared to the Surpass where it's closed because of the sensor port. And that means on the Surpass the shaft hits the end of this alloy part here, and you can't shim it any closer even if you wanted to, because this hits the back of this. And also you can oil it, I suppose, quite easily. Very nice legend engraving here for checking the timing. It's as clear as anything. Whereas on the Surpass, it's very difficult to see. It's shiny and reflective, and the engraving in the alloy is very hard to read. There's a pointer. It's possible to measure the stator width very easily from there to there, whereas on this one you can measure it just in that point, but some calipers, mine with a big tip, won't actually fit in there, and it's hidden all the way around the end of the stator, whereas on this one it's exposed both sides all the way around, making it easy to check. The collector on the front, they speak of being 3mm silver plated collector, isn't actually as large as the one on the Surpass. This one's huge, goes all the way out to as far as it can go, whereas this one, it's just got quite a gap, but still nice and thick and silver plated. It weighs 145.4, which compared to the others, X Factor 17.5 weighed 145.2, so it's almost identical. The Hobby Wing was the lightest at 136.8. The new Surpass was 148.5, so they're getting the weight down. It's pretty close. You can measure the stator length. Now the absolute minimum is 19.30, and some manufacturers sailed a bit close to the wind recently, so they've tended to go back up a little bit, so that they're not going to fall foul of the regulations. And you've got to make sure they've done a really good job on the insulation. The green, it stops halfway up, very neatly done, so you can actually measure the lamination size. 19.72. They probably put an extra lamination on to be safe. 1967, does vary slightly on the way round. I can measure the winding resistance. Best resistances we've had so far. I don't think they can go any lower. In fact, if they've increased the stator size slightly, they couldn't possibly get lower, so set that to 0. And we've had 0.037 pretty much across the board on resistances on all the new motors, so I should imagine it's going to be about the same. Yeah, there you go, 0.037. Just goes from 0.036 to 0.037, so I'll put 037 across the board. So that's just about the same as all the others. It's the same I measured on the Surpass, which they call their very low resistance, and 037 Hobby Wing, and the Trinity was 037 as well, so it's pretty much about as low as they're going to go, I think. Tune it obviously and get a kV reading and the time and see how accurate it is, so I'll just set that up. I tuned the motor as close as I could to 6.0 amps. The M bell is very sensitive to movement. It's very hard to set it exactly. It's one of the more sensitive ones to adjust. The 3 screws in the back, depending on what sequence you tighten them up, can affect the actual figure. Anyway, it's close as 6.0, so I can compare it to all the others I've tested. So you've got quite a good kV here. We'll look at the chart in a minute. 3467, not insane, but high. So it's just a matter of checking how good the timing board is now. It's 48 average and a spread of 49, 47, 49, so it's not 100% together, but within 2 degrees is pretty typical and close enough to not worry about. Let's have a look, see how accurate the timing is for the M bell. With this one it'd be quite easy to see. It'd be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. and that point is about 54, so it's way out from what I actually measured. Taking the motor apart, and there's the rotor. On the rotor it says Fantom 12.5mm HT, which probably means high torque raw spec, and it's got a black end for balancing. There's no epoxy stuck in this one. There's a step on the back, which means you can't change the shimming really when it's put into the sensor. You can't adjust it any further in, it's what it is. The sensor plate is held by an aluminium ring, same as on the Surpass, and there's quite a thick insulated like piece of card really. It stops it. This is aluminium rubbing through, I guess, or if you bad soldering job, just stops it shorting out. This rotor, the magnetic part, I just measured it. The diameter is 12.49, 12.50 being the maximum, so they've taken it out to the max, but the magnetic length part is, I would say, about 24.06, which is about a millimeter or even a millimeter and a half shorter than some of the others I've measured. The X factor I measured 25.5, so a millimeter and a half extra. That does actually give you extra power, torque. It gives you a better field around the wires. Hobby wing was 25mm, so it's slightly shorter than the others. The end valve, it's got just the 3 screws hold it together, and it rotates in this part. You can see where the 3 screws that hold it together, these 3 tiny screws. I'll point out that these can fall out if you don't do them up properly. You might consider putting a little Loctite on them to stop them falling out. Besides that, this is a press fit. This is a press fit into the can, so it's not going to rattle like some motors where these aren't tight, they rattle like anything. It means you can't take out the stator very easily. Look at the inside of that. It's a very large gap between the three parts of the stator. The windings around a leg, and there's a gap between them. Some motors, this gap is minuscule, hardly anything at all, and also the part here that faces the rotor, some of these are very thin. This is nice and thick. The actual center leg, I can't see how thick it is. It's not very wide, which means you can get a nice tight winding of wire. But if you make it too thin, you don't get any magnetic field can pass up through there. And I'll just demonstrate showing you that was on the and one from a motor that's been cut apart. You can see the gap here is well, it's quite wide, but it's not as wide as on this one. And that part there is reasonably thick, which is on this one, and this is very wide on this one, which gives you a lot of magnetic field force, a lot of torque, but it does push the wires further apart, meaning that the wiring be more wire and more resistance. And on this one, I believe, looking at it, that part in the middle there, the leg, looks fairly narrow, and of course the piece that on top needs to be fairly thick as well. I can't see that on this one how thick that is. We can kind of see through there, and it's about the same, I would say. Sorry if that's not in focus, it's a bit difficult. The windings themselves are pretty neatly done. They can be haphazard on some motors with bits of wire hanging out and that get pushed back in by whoever's winding. These are pretty neat actually. They've obviously got the the experienced winders doing these motors. What about all important torque of the rotor? Now we've seen weak rotors Gauss wise that are useless, give lots of kV and no acceleration, so we don't want one of them. We've also seen very strong ones. The X factor, I think it was over 1600, around 1600 Gauss, which is really strong. Others around 1500. Even the Hobby Wing didn't quite make that. The one I measured was only about 1450, which I think is too low. So let's see what this high torque one is. That's 1550. Well, that's about what I would put in a motor these days. That's North Pole. Let's try the South. 1567. Nice and strong, so it's going to be pretty torquey, and with a good kV, it's going to be a very good motor. The new Surpass V5R 13.5 turn, tuned to 6 amps. It's given a very high kV, one of the highest we've seen, 4252. Timing is 46. It's spread from 45 to 48, so not spot on, but it's not too bad. And what about, how's the end bell showing that up? The end bell time in the scale is a bit hard to see because it's engraved on silver, so it's a bit reflective. You've got the little pointer there, and also it goes not in 10-degree steps, it goes from 30 to 60, so the middle is 45, and it's just about on 45, so it's pretty much spot on the 46 average. So it's pretty close once you can see where you are on the graduations. The weight of the new V5R 13.5, the previous one weighed about 153 grams, and this one weighs 149.7, so they've lost a little bit of weight. On the shaft it's got the code C75125, which is the same code they used on the previous versions of this, the V4. And the shaft protrusion is still nice and short. It's 13.99, so it's nice and short, and it's got the flat taken right up to the face again, which we saw on the previous motor, which is very good. Minimum stator length, which has caught a few manufacturers out recently, is supposed to be 19.30. Now it's a bit difficult with this motor. The only place you can do it when it's assembled is from here to here. All the other parts of the stator of this end have been hidden by the can. It could be done by taking it apart, which will probably be I'll have to do because I can't get this part in. The torque, although this is the same rotor apparently from the code, it's very torquey, which means they might have changed the stator design slightly, thickened it up in certain areas to give more torque. It's very torquey. It stops almost straight away when you try spinning it, so I'll check that when I take it apart. Now the resistance, they talk about ultra low resistance, and that is very important obviously, so the motor doesn't overheat and gives you maximum performance. The lower the better, but they still have to get the amount of wire onto the stator, so really they can't go any lower than they have got recently, even using the purest copper wire. Anyway, we'll check it. 0, and then you need a reasonable contact on these connectors. Some motors are more difficult to connect than others on these tabs, but 0.022 is very good. Let's just try and get the middle one. 0.022, and I guess the last one will probably be the same. 0.022, near enough. So previously 0.023, 0.022, we saw that exactly the same on the previous Surpass, the red one on the sheet here. I've got it there. So it looks like the stator is still exactly the same. It is ultra low resistance. The lowest resistance I've ever seen was on the SMC. Others are normally 0.023, 022 on the X Factor. So that's a good result, and about as low as we're going to see on any motor, because it's got to meet the regulations. Taking the motor apart, it's basically just two parts of the can that slides off. Non-magnetic screws, as we've seen before, that go all the way through the motors. A lot of the motors now don't have that, they're just screwed on the end only. The rotor, it says on it, it's got some dimensions, Surpass Hobby, and then it's just got some dimensions. It says 12.5 by 7.15 by 25.2. But the code is the same as previously, so we're going to measure the strength of that in a second. So a couple of shims fall out. The sensor board design looks, well, it looks the same. But looking inside the motor at the windings and that, I notice, well, besides being very neatly wound, inside there's a very big gap between the three parts of the stator where the windings. Some manufacturers, there's no gap virtually here, and also this part of the stator is quite thick. Some manufacturers, this has been very thin, which all affects the performance of the motor. The large gap will cause it to feel nice and clunky or chunky or whatever. When your rotor turns, it jumps from one magnetic field here to the next one in a nice strong jump. When these gaps are very close together, it tends to be more smooth action. Which one is better? Well, this one's got high revs, so I don't know, we haven't measured the strength of the rotor yet. The rest of the construction's the same, I think, as we've seen before. Even says on here, the V4, and this is now V5, so they're obviously using most of the parts they've used before. Now with the stator exposed, we take the end off, it's much easier now to measure the stator width. The epoxy insulation is only part of the way up, so you can actually measure the stator, not the epoxy as well. 19.65 at that point, 1955. So I mean, they do vary. These laminations squeezed together and glued and squeezed, so they do change when they take the pressure off and they set, so it varies about 1955, about 1965. Well within tolerant rules. Just measure the strength of the rotor. On the previous one, which had the same code, the strength varied all over the place. Then the manufacturing tolerances are accurate. They could be anything from under 15 up to 1550. So let's just see what this is. So that pole is 1500. That pole is about 1525. So it's the same as the previous motor. The sensor is held in place by a nice solid aluminium support, and one thing I think they've done is the rotor is, and the gap here between the rotor and the sensor board is slightly closer than it used to be. So I think they've raised the sensor board slightly to reduce that gap. I've completed the tests on the new Fantom Icon Torque and the Surpass V5R. I've tested the 17.5 and the 13.5s in both, and I've got the results on the charts, and I'm going to have a look at them and see how they compare to, say, the Hobby Wing and the X Factor and some others. So the first one we can look at is let's look at the 17.5. I've shown you all about the construction, so let's look at the figures. Most people only can only interested in a couple of figures. That's the kV and the torque. From this chart, measuring the kV at fixed amps will give you a good indication of how they're going to perform, and also we've got the Gauss strength of the rotor. Looking at the kVs alone won't tell you how good a motor's going to be. Okay, it's going to be high revving if it's got a high kV, and on a fast track you can get a good speed out of it, but it might not get there as quickly as some others. But we'll just look at the kV first. Now, the Trinity X Factor has been going particularly well in races, and that I've checked a couple, and the kV was around 3.4 on that one, which is very good, which was higher than some previous motors. For instance, the new Hobbywing is only 3.241. Now, looking at the V5R, 3.439, so that's almost identical to that X Factor one there. And on the Fantom, 3.472, again very close. And in fact the Fantom was at 6.1 amps. I couldn't get it at 60. N bell, when you do up the 3 screws, depending on how you do them up, changes the timing fractionally and the amps. Not insane, but obviously we're getting into a higher kV than previously, and these 3 motors are almost identical in kV. So what about the torque? Well, let's look at the rotor strength. Well, the Trinity's got particularly good strength, 1600 Gauss, and to get that kV as well, that's pretty impressive. So it's going to have a lot of bottom end. What about the Hobbywing? Was low at only about 1450 Gauss, and didn't have any RPM either, so I would say it's not going to be as good as the others. The Surpass, I didn't, someone wanted this motor before I could check it, and I haven't got another one, but it's got the same rotors as in the previous one, the C75125, and I did check the 13.5 version, and the rotor strength was 1500/1525, so just over 1500, which is pretty strong. But the Fantom Icon, 1557, 1573, it's getting up to the Trinity area and with the Trinity kV. So these two motors, the Trinity and the Fantom, are both almost identical. Which one would be better? Winding resistance, 0.037, 0.037, and the Surpass. They're all round about as good as you can get them. Anything else that might give one the edge? 145 grams Fantom, 145 grams Trinity, 148.5 Surpass. There's hardly anything in it. Hobbywing on 36.8. If you wanted really looking save weight. Anything else positive or negative? Well, the Fantom's got a slightly longer protruding shaft, which is getting quite critical on some cars. It pushes in the side of your lipo if you're not careful, just over 15 millimeters. The Surpass was nice and short. The Hobbywing very short, 13.3, and the Trinity was long. Very long actually, and some people might find that actually rubs if they're not careful on the side of their lipo, so that's a negative of the Trinity. Anything else? Well, accuracy of the indications of the timing if you didn't have a machine to do it. Trinity was, I would say, was spot on at 50, and the N bell showed 50. The Hobbywing was out. The N bell was on 54 and I was only measuring 47. The Surpass was 49 and the N bell was 48, so that's almost spot on. And the Fantom was out 48 measured and the N bell was showing about 53, 54. So I don't know if others would be as accurate, but the Trinity was definitely spot on, as was the Surpass one, and that was for the 17.5 turns. One more thing, Surpass you can normally pick up a lot cheaper than the others. The others are all £90, which I think is the limit, the maximum you're allowed to charge. Surpass, you can pick this up for £70. And it's very well made. All the motors are well made. Trinity, the front end of the way they've lightened it looks suspecting a big accident. I don't know whether the motor will actually deform slightly on those fingers at the front. Colour wise, well, they're all black now, except the Trinity has got some blue highlights. So that's the 17.5s. I did mention that the length of the magnetic part on the rotors is quite long on some of these. The Trinity is 25.5. The Fantom I could only measure about 24, so there's a massive difference on the rotor. That's probably why it's got a little extra strength as well. The Surpass one I measured on this version, it was just 25.2 millimeters, so it's very close to the longer ones. So that's 17.5, and a quick look at the 13.5s. The 13.5 tests. Down here I've got there's a Trinity X Factor. I'll go all the way up onto the SMC, etc. on here, and the original Surpass. We can look at that. Hobby Wing, a G3R. There's the Surpass, the new V5R, and there's the new Fantom Icon Torque Spec. And there, in fact, is the Fantom Icon I did with pins. Anyway, the important things to look at are the KB. KB on the Fantom, again, I could nearest I could get was 6.1 amps. I couldn't get it to 6.0. 4174 KB. The X Factor 3969. But the Surpass I got 4252, which is a fantastic KB, better than the insane Fantom. But all these are now getting over 4,000. SMC we know is one of the highest revving ones. 4319 is the highest of the, that's very revvy motor. So that's the KV. What about the torque? How do they get there? Well, I've already discussed the Trinity X Factor. It has about 1600 Gauss rotor again, which means that the very good KV, very good rotor. It's going to have acceleration and revs. The winding resistances, just while I'm looking at them, 0.022, 022, 023, they're all about the same. The SMC was the only one I found was a little bit lower, but otherwise they're all the same resistance, so we don't need to worry about that. Going back to the Gauss, the Fantom Icon, I measured about 1570, nice and strong, getting up to the same area as the X Factor. So with a good KV, good Gauss, it's going to fast and good acceleration. What about the Surpass? That's got very good KV, and the rotor strength was a bit less, only 15/1525. That's probably why it got a little more KV. But anything over 1500 is still a very good Gauss strength, so it's still going to have extra acceleration. And as I pointed out, the design of the stators on the Surpass and the Fantom, with the big gap between the three poles on the stator, will give you a nice chunky torquey feel to the motor. Again, the Hobby Wing, the rotor strength varied. This one was again not better than the other one I tested, around about 1470 odd. So on the 13.5, I think the Hobby Wing is a good motor, as long as they can maintain the strength of the rotor. On the 17.5 it was much weaker for some reason. I've already talked about the Trinity X Factor. The old Fantom with pins did 4056. The new Fantom 4175. So they've improved that I think when they took the pins out, I did get more revs. The old Surpass 3879, that's gone up a lot. I mean, there's been a massive step in performance on the Surpass from the V4S to the V5R. That's really noticeable. And the strength of the rotor was about 1520, has now gone. Same, it's the same code, C75125, C75125. So with the same rotor, they've increased the KB dramatically, so there's a good design change. Negatives I've already discussed. On the other motor, the Trinity's got a rather long protrusion on the shaft. Weight wise, 145 grams for the Trinity, 144 grams for the Fantom, 149 grams for the Surpass, all around the same area. Hobbywing is the lightest again, and this SMC is lightest of all. Otherwise, old Fantom was red, it's now black. Basically all these are black. Black is what the customer wants, and that's what they get now. I mentioned the cost. The Surpass is the cheaper one. So which one to use? Well, in 10th touring cars, I don't think you can go wrong with the Fantom, the Surpass, the X Factor. All perform, I think, about the same. The Hobbywing 13.5, I think if you get a good one with a good rotor, I think it's going to be as good as these others. It's slightly down on the kV, but I mean it's a very well made motor. On the 17.5s, again the same. X Factor, Fantom, Surpass. I would use any one of those three, and I think I wouldn't worry about one being a bit better or worse than the others, really. It's very close score. So it'll be interesting to see how people put them to work. They're all very well made. I don't think they're going to burn out very easily or fall to bits or break, except perhaps the X Factor in a bad crash. I would like to see what happens to them. So that's the conclusions. I expect there'll be some more motors coming along soon, but at the moment I've got a good choice of at least I would choose those three, or even the Hobbywing